I dress like your idol Eddie Murphy because he's not coming. Your idol doesn't give a fuck about you, Kevin.
Three men, three completely different comedy eras, three different styles. And yet, somehow, every single time they opened their mouths to do an impression, the room stopped. People lost it. Professionals who had seen everything, cast members who were paid to keep a straight face, studio audiences who came ready for anything, all of them were destroyed. We're talking about Kevin Hart, Eddie Murphy, and Bill Hader. Now, before you say anything, yes, you've seen the clips. Yes, you've probably watched them on your phone at 2 a.m., laughing until you cried. But I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to see all three of these men in a way you've never seen them before. Because the story behind why their impressions hit differently, the context, the stakes, the moments where everyone in the room literally couldn't function, that is what nobody talks about. And I need you to stay with me to the end, because the final story in this video, about what happened live on national television when one writer decided to sabotage his own performer, that is one of the most chaotic, hilarious, and genuinely unbelievable moments in the history of American comedy. Let's go. What makes an impression actually break people? Before we get into the legends themselves, let's settle something. You've heard impressions your whole life. Your uncle does a terrible Arnold Schwarzenegger at Thanksgiving. Your coworker has a mediocre Morgan Freeman that they bust out at every office party. So what separates the impression that gets a polite chuckle from the impression that breaks the room? Here's what most people don't realize. The best impressions don't just copy a voice. They expose something. They take a person's energy, their essence, their contradictions, their most recognizable quirks, and they amplify those qualities until they become a funhouse mirror version of reality. The audience isn't just recognizing the voice. They're recognizing the truth inside the impression. That's what makes it land like a freight train. And here's the real question I want you to sit with right now. Can you think of the last time an impression genuinely stopped you cold? Not just made you smile, but actually made you grab the person next to you? Hold that thought, because the three men we're about to talk about have each mastered that art in completely different, utterly fascinating ways. Eddie Murphy, the original disruptor. Let's start where the story starts. Let's start with Eddie Murphy. It's 1980. Eddie Murphy is 19 years old. He has no business being on the cast of Saturday Night Live, a show that, at that point, had already seen its original legendary cast depart and was hemorrhaging viewers. The network was in crisis. The show was in freefall. And then this teenager from Roosevelt, Long Island, New York, walks in and starts doing impressions. We need to pause here because the word impressions doesn't do justice to what Eddie Murphy was doing. This wasn't mimicry. This was possession. His ability to capture the voice, the body, the physical energy, and the comedic contradictions of other celebrities was, and this is documented fact, unlike anything that had been seen on that stage before. Chris Rock, one of the greatest stand-up comedians alive, once said on the Questlove Supreme podcast that Eddie Murphy has an impression of KRS-One that is, and I'm paraphrasing, spot on and absolutely hilarious. Now think about that. Murphy's impression catalog is so vast, so deep, that even fellow legends are discovering new ones. But let's talk about the impressions that didn't just make people laugh, the ones that broke rooms, broke careers, broke expectations. The Stevie Wonder situation. Murphy started doing his Stevie Wonder impression as a teenager. By the time he got to SNL, it was fully developed. He had captured Wonder's ethereal vocal tone, his positive spirit, his physical mannerisms with frightening accuracy. But here's the part nobody tells you. His impression of Stevie Wonder was so good, so committed, that the real Stevie Wonder showed up in a 1983 SNL sketch, not to call Murphy out, but to compete with him. The sketch featured the actual Stevie Wonder trying to get a job as a Stevie Wonder impersonator, with Murphy playing the role of the coach, showing Wonder how to properly imitate himself. Read that again. Eddie Murphy showed Stevie Wonder how to be Stevie Wonder. That is a level of audacity that has never been replicated. But even that wasn't Murphy's most explosive moment. James Brown's Celebrity Hot Tub Party, November 5th, 1983. This is the one. This is the SNL sketch that became one of the most famous in the show's entire history. And if you haven't seen it, stop this video and go watch it, then come back, because the backstory is even better. Murphy appeared wearing nothing but a velvet bathrobe with "Hot Tub Man Number 1" written on the back, a wig, and gold bikini briefs. He danced and sang around a hot tub as James Brown, channeling the godfather of soul's gravelly voice, his rhythmic patterns, his explosive on-stage energy, and yes, his famously inaudible mumble during performances. The audience was completely unraveling. Cast members could barely hold it together. And the performance built and built until Murphy stripped down to a Speedo and jumped into the tub. Now here's the part that nobody knew for years after. When Murphy later told Jimmy Fallon the story on The Tonight Show, he revealed that James Brown himself had actually loved the impression. Not just tolerated it, loved it. Brown apparently approached Murphy after the two had worked together on a separate project and told him, and this is Murphy doing the impression of Brown telling him, that he should play him in a movie. Murphy said he replied, "James, wouldn't people be laughing?" And Brown's response was, "They ain't gonna laugh if you do it serious. People are gonna know that you're serious." Brown also, in the same conversation, introduced Murphy to his daughter as a potential romantic prospect and told him to bury his money in the woods to hide it from the government. Only James Brown. Murphy couldn't commit to the biopic. He joked later that, quote, "My split days are coming to an end very shortly," and ultimately the late Chadwick Boseman would play Brown in Get On Up. But the fact that Murphy's impression was so accurate, so full of life, that the actual person wanted him to play them in a dramatic role, that tells you everything you need to know about Eddie Murphy's gift. And here's something you might not have known. By the time Murphy was being nominated for Emmy Awards, he was doing it as a teenager in his first season. He would later become an influence so profound that future SNL cast members, including the next person in this story, would be measured against his legacy. Eddie Murphy's impressions were dangerous enough that the real people he was imitating started showing up. Which impression do you think was braver? Doing a live, full-body impression of James Brown, or standing next to the real Stevie Wonder and showing him how to be himself? Drop your answer in the comments. Bill Hader, the psychic impressionist. Now let's talk about Bill Hader. Hader joined the SNL cast in 2005, and almost immediately, critics and cast members realized they were watching something unusual. Not just a funny guy, not just a good character actor. What they were watching was arguably, and this is a word used by multiple television journalists, the most gifted celebrity impressionist to ever appear on Saturday Night Live. Read that again. Not one of the best, possibly the best, in the entire history of the show. His range was genuinely staggering. Al Pacino, Vincent Price, Clint Eastwood, Charlie Sheen, Alan Alda, James Carville, Rick Perry, Franklin Roosevelt, Phil Spector, and dozens more. But it wasn't just the range, it was the precision. Clint Eastwood himself told E! News after seeing Hader's impression of him, quote, "It was good. Hader has me down pretty good." Eastwood, the man himself, who has made a career out of saying very few words, used several of them to compliment Bill Hader. But let's talk about the one that broke rooms the hardest, the one that had a secret weapon none of the audience knew about. Stefan, and the man who tried to break him. Stefan was a character Hader created alongside SNL writer John Mulaney, a flamboyant New York City nightlife correspondent who would appear on Weekend Update and describe the hottest clubs in the city in the most unhinged, surreal language imaginable.
Here with some tips on what they should check out is our city correspondent, Stefan.
The character became one of the most beloved in SNL's modern history. But Stefan had a secret. Because Weekend Update is performed live and read from cue cards, Mulaney had access to something that most writers don't, a nuclear weapon disguised as a script change. Hader was famously a perfectionist. He admitted to Howard Stern in 2013 that he gets very nervous before live segments and goes over his lines obsessively. Mulaney knew this, and Mulaney, with the precision of a comedy surgeon, used this knowledge to go to war. What Mulaney would do, and this is confirmed by Hader himself, was write entirely new jokes on the cue cards right before the live broadcast, sometimes without telling Hader what was coming. Other times he'd tell him literally as he walked out onto the stage, just enough to shake him, not enough to prepare him. The result? Hader, on live national television, fighting with every muscle in his body to keep from completely losing it. His signature move, covering his face with his hand, turning away from Seth Meyers, pressing his lips together, wasn't a character choice. That was Bill Hader trying desperately not to shatter into pieces on camera. But there was one night that is remembered as the hardest Hader ever broke, the night of the Sydney Applebaum joke. During a Halloween edition of Weekend Update, Hader was performing as Stefan, reading from the cue cards. He was expecting certain jokes. He had rehearsed certain beats, and then he flipped to a cue card that had fresh writing on it, writing he had never seen. He told the story to Howard Stern. The new card read, "Hey Seth, you know how Blackula's the Black Dracula?" Myers says yes, and then the punchline. Well, they made a Jewish one. You know what Jewish Dracula's called? And the answer on the card? Sydney Applebaum. Hader said he lost it, completely. The kind of break that doesn't recover for several seconds. The audience could see him unraveling in real time. And in that moment, that pure, unscripted live television moment of a man being defeated by a name, something magic happened. The audience wasn't just laughing at the joke. They were laughing at the collapse of a professional. They were watching someone be genuinely ambushed by comedy, live, with nowhere to hide. That is what makes impressions, and the people behind them, break rooms. It's not always about the impression itself. Sometimes it's about what happens to the person doing it. Later, when Hader left SNL in 2013, and his departure was described by multiple outlets as a major blow to the show, Seth Meyers joked that there was now a vacancy in the impression department. When Hader appeared on Late Night, Meyers cheekily told him, "You were kind of known as the impression guy at SNL, but you obviously have Barry and other things on your plate, and I feel like I'm kind of the impression guy now." He then proceeded to do one-word impressions of Al Pacino, Vince Vaughn, and Michael Keaton. And Bill Hader, the man who spent 8 years keeping a straight face through Mulaney's attacks, could not stop laughing. He was undone by one word, by Seth Meyers doing impressions. The irony was exquisite. By the time Hader left SNL, he had been nominated for an Emmy Award for his work on the show, the first male cast member to receive such a nomination since Eddie Murphy himself back in 1983. That is not a coincidence. That is a lineage. Bill Hader spent 8 years being systematically ambushed by his own writer. Would you have quit, or would you have tried to get revenge? Tell me in the comments, because the answer reveals a lot about how you handle chaos. Kevin Hart, when the student becomes the spectacle. Now, Kevin Hart. Here's what's interesting about Kevin Hart's relationship to impressions. He doesn't do them the same way Murphy or Hader do. He doesn't lock into a voice and disappear into it. What Kevin Hart does is something arguably more difficult. He becomes the emotional reality of a scene and then narrates the impression around himself.
Oh my God! Hey!
He plays himself reacting to someone else, and the person he's imitating exists in the space between the words. Watch any Kevin Hart stand-up and count how many times he imitates his father, his friends, his co-stars. He's not doing voices, he's doing personalities, and that is its own art form. But the connection between Kevin Hart and impressions goes deeper than his own act. Kevin Hart grew up idolizing Eddie Murphy. He's said it publicly, repeatedly, without embarrassment. Murphy is his blueprint, his North Star, the reason he does what he does. And this creates a fascinating dynamic, because when you idolize someone that much, you don't just watch them, you study them, you try to be them, to understand them, to absorb their energy. And then something remarkable happened. The Netflix Roast, May 2026. The roast of Kevin Hart was one of the most anticipated comedy events in years. Streamed live on Netflix, it featured an extraordinary lineup: Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Tom Brady, Cat Williams, and yes, roast veteran Jeff Ross, who walked out onto that stage in a red leather bodysuit, a full red leather bodysuit, because it was the exact outfit Eddie Murphy wore in his legendary 1987 stand-up special Raw. Now pause here, because this moment is layered. Jeff Ross, known as the Roastmaster General for his legendary performances across decades, chose to honor both Hart and Murphy simultaneously in that single visual. By walking out dressed as Murphy, Hart's idol, He was making a statement about who Hart aspires to be.
Yeah, tonight I dress like your idol Eddie Murphy because he's not coming. Your idol doesn't give a fuck about you, Kevin.
While simultaneously using that aspiration as ammunition for a roast. It was a brilliant, double-edged comedy sword. The audience caught it immediately. People who knew the reference, and a lot of people in that room knew, felt the electricity of it. Hart himself had to process being roasted by someone who looked like the person he spent his life trying to emulate.
Tonight, live all over the world, we celebrate the crack baby that could, the great Eddie Smurfy.
Tom Brady, making his roast appearance, took a different swing. He pointed out that the GOAT roast had gone from Brady to Hart, noted his 7 Super Bowl wins against Hart's 2 ride-along movies, and called him the 3rd most famous person in Jumanji. Every word landed, but the moment that nobody saw coming, the one that broke the room in a completely different way, was Cat Williams walking out, because Cat Williams and Kevin Hart had publicly feuded. Williams had referred to Hart on Shannon Sharpe's podcast as an industry plant. The falling out had been very public, very messy, very real. And the moment Williams walked through that door, the tension in the room spiked. You could feel it. This wasn't just comedy anymore. This was the edge of something real. And that tension, that genuine, unscripted, this could go anywhere tension, is exactly what makes the greatest comedy moments unforgettable. Because comedy without stakes is just noise. It's the danger that makes you lean forward. The Kevin Hart and Eddie Murphy connection, live. Earlier, on Kevin Hart's Sirius XM podcast, Comedy Gold Mines, Hart had a conversation with Murphy that tells you everything about how both men feel about this art form. Hart told Murphy directly, "Eddie, I don't like talking to you about stand-up no more. I'm not falling for the fumming trap. I'm sick of you. I'm sick of your ST. Every time we talk, he leaves me with a piece of information and I feel like I got gold. That is not admiration. That is reverence. That is a grown man, one of the most successful comedians on the planet, telling you that another man's words feel like gold to him." Murphy told Hart during that conversation that his original plan had been to do Dolomite Is My Name, return to SNL, do Coming to America, and then go back to stand-up. The pandemic shut it all down. Murphy is still building toward that stand-up return. And when he finally gets back on that stage, every comedian in the world, including Kevin Hart, will be watching. If Eddie Murphy returns to stand-up for a full special, and this is genuinely on the table, what impressions do you want to see him do in 2026? Give me 3 in the comments. Go. The moments that actually broke everyone. A breakdown. Let's go one by one. These are the definitive moments where Kevin Hart, Eddie Murphy, and Bill Hader, through impressions, character work, and sheer comedic presence, didn't just make a room laugh. They shattered it. Moment number 1. Eddie Murphy and the Real Stevie Wonder, 1983. This is one of the most surreal moments in television history. Murphy had been doing his Stevie Wonder impression long enough that it was a known quantity. And then SNL did the impossible. They booked the actual Stevie Wonder for a sketch where Murphy, as the coach, would critique Wonder's own impersonation of himself. Murphy's version was judged more accurate than Wonder's. The studio audience was struggling to process what they were watching. The layers of absurdity, a man being told he's doing himself wrong, were almost too much to handle. The sketch worked because it was anchored by Murphy's complete, unblinking commitment to the bit. Moment number 2. James Brown's Celebrity Hot Tub Party, November 5th, 1983. Everything about this sketch broke the room. The costume, the choreography, the voice. Murphy singing an incoherent stream of funk-inspired syllables while dancing around a steaming hot tub in a Speedo. The cape bit, a recreation of Brown's famous cape stunt, performed in a hot tub setting. The audience was gone within 30 seconds.
James Brown's Celebrity Hot Tub Party from SNL featuring Eddie Murphy.
Cast members were fighting to keep it together backstage. And then the revelation years later that James Brown had watched it, loved it, and asked Murphy to make a movie adds a layer of comedic poetry that couldn't have been planned. Moment number 3. The Sydney Applebaum incident. Bill Hader on live television. We've covered this, but let's sit with it for a second. A man who prepares obsessively, who has spent years developing his craft, who has delivered hundreds of live performances, was defeated by two words written on a cue card by a man who understood exactly how to dismantle him. The fact that millions of people watched it happen in real time, and that Hader's genuine, uncontrollable laughter was more entertaining than any scripted moment could have been, is the definition of lightning in a bottle. Moment number 4. Bill Hader on Late Night, The Return. When Hader appeared on Seth Meyers' late-night show after leaving SNL, the dynamic had flipped. Hader was no longer the impressionist in the hot seat. He was the guest, the legend, the one who'd left. And then Meyers started doing impressions. One line for Pacino, one word for Vince Vaughn, one word for Michael Keaton. And Hader, the man who'd spent 8 years being professionally broken by John Mulaney, who'd trained himself to maintain composure through the most chaotic comedy attacks imaginable, could not stop laughing. It was Meyers' night to break the room, and the room he broke was Bill Hader. Moment number 5. The roast of Kevin Hart. Jeff Ross dressed as Eddie Murphy. This one operates on multiple frequencies. The image of Jeff Ross emerging in Murphy's iconic red leather is funny by itself. The knowledge that Hart considers Murphy his idol, and that Ross chose this specific costume to roast him, adds another layer. And beneath that is the unspoken question the costume poses to Hart. How do you live up to this? Which is the most devastating roast joke of the night, and it wasn't even a sentence. It was a wardrobe choice. What these three men have in common, and why it matters. You might think Kevin Hart, Eddie Murphy, and Bill Hader have nothing in common beyond being funny. But look closer. All three of them use impressions not just as comedy tools, but as emotional communication. Murphy uses impressions to explode the mythology of fame, to make giants human and therefore funny. Hader uses impressions to deconstruct the gap between reality and performance, between the person and the persona. And Hart uses impressions of his father, his friends, himself, to be vulnerable, to invite the audience into his actual life. All three of them are also documentarians. They don't just perform impressions, they archive the energy of other people. They preserve what it felt like to watch James Brown move, what it sounded like to hear Al Pacino rage, what it looked like to be Kevin Hart's dad when he said the wrong thing. And all three of them, at some point in their career, stood in a room and broke it. Not broke as in failed, broke as in shattered, cracked the composure of an entire room wide open and let the light in. Bill Hader was nominated for an Emmy at SNL, the first male cast member to receive such recognition since Eddie Murphy in 1983. That parallel isn't coincidence. Murphy essentially wrote the template for what it means to be a transformative SNL cast member.
35 years, but Eddie Murphy is returning to host Saturday Night Live. SNL just announced its fall lineup.
Hader read it, lived it, and then wrote the next chapter. And Kevin Hart? Kevin Hart is the chapter after that. He's the one standing on the shoulders of both of them, looking out at a future where comedy is bigger than television, bigger than stages, where it lives on phones and podcasts and streaming services and reaches corners of the world that Murphy and Hader could never have imagined. The bigger picture, why impressions still matter. Here's something worth thinking about. We live in a world where we have access to more media than any generation in history. You can watch James Brown perform in 1968 in HD. You can stream Eddie Murphy's 1983 Delirious special right now. You can watch Al Pacino in Scarface in the palm of your hand. You can watch the actual thing anytime, anywhere. And yet, Eddie Murphy doing James Brown, Bill Hader doing Al Pacino, Kevin Hart doing his father, these things still break rooms. Why? Because a great impression isn't a copy, it's a conversation. It's one artist saying to another, I see you, I understand you, and I love you enough to embarrass you. It's a tribute and a roast simultaneously. It's the highest possible compliment disguised as mockery. And when an impression is so good that the real person asks you to play them in a movie, or when the room erupts not because of the impression itself, but because of the impressionist's genuine involuntary laughter, you're watching something that transcends technique. You're watching two human beings collide. The performer and the subject, the art and the reality, and the audience gets to be there for it. That's why impressions matter. That's why they will always matter. Not because they're funny, although they are, but because they are, at their core, acts of radical empathy. They are one person temporarily becoming another and finding something true in the process. The question that ties it all together. So here's where we land. Eddie Murphy, 19 years old, saving a dying television institution, doing impressions so accurate that the people he imitated wanted to hire him. Bill Hader, 8 years of live television, a writer trying to destroy him every single week, breaking and breaking and breaking, and somehow always coming back together. Kevin Hart, standing in a room at his own roast, watching a man dressed as his idol, understanding in real time what it means to be seen by the comedy world as someone who belongs in that lineage. 3 men. 3 completely different eras of comedy. 3 completely different styles of making rooms break. And yet all 3 of them would tell you the same thing. You don't do impressions to show off. You do them because you love the person enough to try. Because you've watched them so many times, absorbed them so completely, that they live somewhere inside you, and the only honest thing to do is let them out. Now here's your final question, and I genuinely want you to answer this in the comments, because I will read every single response. If you could see any one comedian do an impression of any person, living or dead, what would you choose, and why? No wrong answers. I'll be reading everything. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This was a long one, and the fact that you stayed means you love this stuff as much as I do. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. Share this with someone who quotes Kevin Hart in their sleep or someone who grew up watching SNL. And leave a comment, because the best conversations on this channel always happen in the comment section. I'll see you in the next one.